Our guest this week is Kelly Burks. He is a filmmaker. We'll be talking about filmmaking. We'll be talking about the organization known as Initiatives of Change, and we'll be talking, interestingly, about prisons and work with young offenders. Kelly Burks is a London-based consultant and filmmaker, designer and photographer. He was born in Bangkok and grew up in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. His varied career includes exploration work in the deserts of the western United States, film production in New York City, and running his own furniture design company in London. He is also a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacture and Commerce. As head of external relations for the London-based charity Initiatives of Change, Kelly also produces and consults on documentary films made by them. Although his professional life revolves around filmmaking, one of his main passions in life includes helping to rehabilitate young offenders, young prisoners. This can be seen in his work for the Spirit of Recovery initiative at Feltham Young Offenders Institution in West London, which hosts over 800 male juvenile offenders. Welcome back to ANN Satellite Television. It's good to have you here for the English Hour, and it's good to be with you. Our guest today is Kelly Burks. He's a filmmaker, and we'll be discussing filmmaking. We will also be discussing Initiatives of Change, which is an interesting organization. And we'll be discussing prison visiting. Well, work in prisons, to be more specific. Kelly, thank you for being our guest. It really is great to have you with us.
Thank you, William. It's great to be here.
The Spirit of Recovery is a charity that works in the Feltham Young Offenders Institution. Many of the adolescents incarcerated there, particularly ones that are struggling with addiction, are trapped in a vicious cycle of relapse and reoffending. Prison offers them a surprising sanctuary from drugs and alcohol. However, these men often relapse when sent out into the community. They then, of course, have a shortage of money and resort to criminal activity to make means ends. As a society, we need to recognize that these adolescents are articulate, smart, and emotionally intelligent. They are a product of their environment. As Kelly Burks tells the inmates, take all those skills you use to commit crime and use them positively, and you will become a great entrepreneur. So Kelly, well, our first subject, prisons, and what a subject. I was actually, for a number of years, down when I lived in Wales, I worked as a prison visitor, but you work at a rather more serious level because you're not merely visiting, but you're actually counseling in prisons. And you're working really at the toughest edge with young offenders. I remember when we were prison visitors in Wales, I could never manage to visit the young offenders because I found it very, very hard. But you do that. You work with young offenders in London.
In Feltham Young Offenders, yes, it's in southwest London or beyond.
Right. Must be really challenging. So what is your, tell us your role there and tell us about it.
Well, sure, just a quick word about Feltham Young Offenders. It's the largest young offenders institution in Europe. There's over 800 young men in there. And it is just young men in there. The way I came to work in there was previously I was doing some work for a charity in Wandsworth Prison for a number of years. And a colleague of mine who started up a charity that does specific work with young offenders in Feltham, knew me and knew what I was doing up in Wandsworth, and called me and asked me if I would come and help them to work with the young offenders. And that appealed to me very much, because I work quite specifically with prisoners who have addiction and alcohol problems, who get caught in the revolving door of, they come into prison, they stop, many of them stop, or at least abate to some degree from using or drinking, and they think that they'll be fine when they go back out, but when they do go back out, they go back often to the same situations, same people, places and things, and relapse. They very quickly run out of money, so they begin committing crime to get money to be able to use and drink, and rearrested and back inside. So that kind of revolving door, a lot of the guys I talked to in Wandsworth were, some of them had been in there for 20 years, 25 years, and never been out for more than 2 or 3 months because of that repetitive thing. And actually towards the end, they got to the point of not wanting to be released because they couldn't take it anymore. They knew what was going to happen, and they would sabotage the release dates, punch an officer or something. So that's a kind of a really tragic story of a life. And when when my friend Rob Bell asked me if I would come and work with Spirit of Recovery in Feltham, I jumped at the chance, because although those guys are in trouble and in prison, they're 18, 19 and 20, 21, and they have their whole life in front of them. So it's good to get in there. That it's great to work with the adults as well, but those guys don't have to spend the next 20 years.
But it is easier to work with the adults, isn't it? I mean, young offenders are very challenging. These young prisoners, what you say, 18, 19, 20? You get some younger, I would imagine.
Well, actually in Feltham, the young offenders range in age from 14 to 21.
That's extraordinary, actually, to think that people as young as 14 might be in jail, in prison, what we're effectively talking about. I mean, bizarre.
Yes, it is hard to believe, but in Feltham they do have people as young as 14 in there. There are murderers, rapists, all kinds of young people have been involved in gangs, usually because they don't have a choice. And they have committed crimes where they need to be put into a facility. And Feltham is broken into 2 sides. Side A is the young offenders who are from 14 to 17, and side B is from 18 to 21. Funnily enough, the side A, the younger side, is much more violent than the older ones.
I can believe it, yeah, because I mean, if I remember rightly from my brief experience as a prison visitor, there tended to be a lot of, you were either very cocky or very depressed if you were a young boy in prison. You either had something to prove or you're in depression. And there were quite a lot of, are there more suicides? Do you get suicides in prison? Do you get some, I suppose?
Certainly, and I mean, just speaking of Feltham, there's a number of young offenders institutions around the UK, but just speaking of Feltham, they did have a lot of bad press some years ago. What I can say about it is that they have they have a tremendous number of good people in there trying to help these young men. There are a lot of agencies in there. I think they do their very best to try and deal with very, very complicated situations. There are many young men who come in there who become suicidal. If anybody is flagged up as having a problem like that, or in depression or something like that, they have something called an ACT document, which they observe them every hour. And anybody like me who comes in to talk to them, then you need to write your observations and perceptions after speaking with them. So they do pay attention to that kind of thing, although young people still, some young men in there still do try to kill themselves. There's a lot of gang issues in there. That's a very complicated thing, and so they always have to watch where people came from, because there's rival gangs in the prisons. People from rival gangs who want to do harm to other people in the prison, and so it's not good enough that they know who those people are, because they often then talk to other people and say, go do that guy in for me, So it's a very, very challenging environment, I would say. Really challenging environment to work in. I have huge respect for people who work in there all the time. I go in there one day a week, and I would say that's just possibly the most important work that I do.
And you're counselling these people. I mean, what does that mean? You're meeting a person. You're meeting them one-on-one?
That's right.
So you're meeting a young offender. Now, these are convicted. They're not on remand. They have been convicted of crimes, by and large?
Yes. Feltham was a remand prison before, but it's changed about a year ago, and it now is a sentence prison. So the population is more stabilized now. We had a lot more young guys moving through the prison, awaiting sentencing and getting sent to various places before, which actually gave us a lot more customers. But we still do our work in there with the guys that are in there, and yes, it is a sentence prison now.
And when you're meeting, I mean, if somebody is sentenced to time in Feltham, I mean, this is up until 21. Then they would go to an adult jail if they're.
Yes. If somebody still has a sentence to serve when they turn 21, they go straight to an adult prison.
And so you would meet these young people on a one-on-one basis and try and deal with their issues, which would largely be a sense of despair, would it? What would be a typical, I'm not asking you to give us a specific case, but typically the kind of person.
There is no typical person, as everywhere. What I would say is that, in general, there's a lot of fear in the prison. There's a lot of despair. There is a lot of anxiety, and they're all terrified of adult prison. But what you see on the surface of everything is a lot of front. So they feel like they have to exist in a quite challenging environment and not be seen as weak. So a lot of the guys put up a lot of front, and of course if you want to have a meaningful conversation with anybody, you have to get beyond that. And working in there has been an absolutely amazing training ground for me into listening. What I discovered painfully when I started there was that I learned very gradually, but pretty quickly, to leave Kelly at the gate of the prison when I went in there. Because the other thing these young guys have are incredible antennae. They can perceive everything. And I've walked into rooms with all different kinds of young men. I've walked into rooms, I do these one-to-ones with them, with young men who are absolutely boiling with rage. It's just rolling off of them. With young men who are depressed, with young men who are very jokey and seem to be fine and having a good time, all different types. But they all have this antenna, and the antenna tells them if you're really there for them or not. And they wouldn't be able to articulate that, but that's what I learned. So when I go into Feltham, I park all my stuff at the door, because even if I'm 1% thinking about my problems or something I forgot to do, while I'm sitting in the room with one of these young guys, because we sit in a room together without officers present, they will very quickly glaze over or become angry or just shut down. And then I can't do anything with them. So it's been a great training ground for me to be really totally present for another human being and non-judgmental and open to whatever, we can talk about.
And you can be non-judgmental. I mean, that's
essential.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the press often vilifies these young guys, calls them animals and monsters, and you read all kinds of things. And actually, some of the things they've done are absolutely horrific. But I've had some, you know, I've been able to get through, luckily, you know, to a number of them, and really through listening and identifying with them and being non-judgmental, and also offering them like a different way, not telling them what to do, but offering them, you know, a different way to live their life if they choose. Because specifically we're working with addicts and alcoholics. They're young, they might not know they are yet, but they do seem to have a problem. And more specifically, we tend to work with young men who are referred to us who sound like they want to change.
Now this is interesting. Addiction, I mean, gosh, we're constrained by time, but I wanted to just touch on this. Addiction in young people. Is it mostly, we're talking about young Western people, mostly alcohol addiction, more than drugs, or is it?
Well, I mean, what I tell them is that it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
You know, whether you're an alcoholic, I mean, alcohol is just another drug. So,
Yes.
I mean, whether you're an alcoholic or an addict, to be honest, most addicts or alcoholics have a foot in each side. You know, that it doesn't really matter. But a person who is addicted is generally using a substance, whatever it is, to get away from uncomfortable feelings that they can't cope with, or events that have happened that they don't know how to deal with, and it's a way to get away from it for a little while, and that's the whole process of addiction. Because
and there is the suggestion that when you deal with addiction in young people, it's different from dealing addiction with an adult. So if I'm an addict as an adult, the standard type of approach might be the Alcoholics Anonymous type of approach, which is basically giving up. I mean, you might phase to it, but you're moving to a commitment to give up alcohol or drugs or whatever it might be forever in your life. And the suggestion which I have heard is that with young people under 21, that kind of approach is really not, you have to approach it differently. Is that correct?
I would say with any alcoholic or addict, you can't say forever. Just don't ever use that word, because they'll run a mile. Yeah. The work I do with Spirit of Recovery is that we talk to them and we give them information about the 12-step fellowships, which are Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, etc., as a way for them to change if they want and to get support once they're back outside of the prison. There also are some meetings that have been running in the prison which they can attend to see what it's like, where people bring in speakers from outside to talk.
I'm running over time, but I have to ask you, the 12 steps, what are the 12 steps? You can't probably remember them off by heart.
I don't think I'll fire them all off one after another here.
But basically.
But the initial step in the 12 steps is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. You know, so that's a really big one, and it sounds like just a little sentence, but some people take years to get to the point of being able to see that. There's a tremendous thing inside of an alcoholic or an addict of not wanting to say that one is an alcoholic or an addict, and not wanting to admit that one is powerless over it. But that is the key. That's the key to change, is admitting that you need help. And just quickly, what I'd like to say about the young men in the prison there is that although they have such bad, a bad image, let's say, or people are sort of terrified of them and fearful of them, I can say from my own experience that the young men I've met in there, I've met very articulate. They might not have all the best words, but they're very articulate when they speak. They can be very charming, highly intelligent, and so the picture of just some kind of wild animal that's, you know, out of control and harming people is not the case. Many of these young men grow up in areas where there are gangs, for instance. They you cannot be in an area where there are gangs and not be in a gang, because if you're not in any gang, you're a target for all the gangs. And that's just the reality of the situations. And the minute they go to one gang, they're asked to do something to break the law, to ensure that they will stay as part of that gang and that they need them for protection from the other gangs. So, and many of them come from such limited means that they can't say, well, I'm going to move over to Kensington, I don't like it here. They can't move anywhere. And they have to exist in these environments, which are really very challenging, and often with parents who are drug addicts or have problems with violence, or perhaps who are in prison themselves. So they grow up in these environments. They just survive the best way they can, and that's often but through breaking the law. That's just the way that they can survive. I often encourage them by saying, if you take all your skills, that you're using to break the law, if you take all those skills, you'd be a great entrepreneur, and just start doing something that's legal. You'll be a great businessman. You'll be a great success. And they're not used to hearing things like that. They're used to being judged, being vilified, being looked at with fear. And it's just really, it's tremendous to work with these young men and give them encouragement, and to give them a way so I don't say forever to them I give them those fellowships, and I say, this is a way that you can get support. And all of these people who are in these meetings are people who had addiction problems before. However, they're in recovery now, they don't use, and they're there exactly for people who are new, who are coming in the door, who want to stop. And you'll get the kind of support you need to live a different kind of life.
This is marvelous. We're going to have to move on because we've got 2 other topics to cover. But I mean, it's so fascinating. We just spend the whole interview talking about this one subject. But we must move on.
Okay.
Initiatives of Change, known in the Middle East as Moral Rearmament, is an international network of people working for reconciliation and peace. The organization is founded on the important principle of promoting inner change, which can then lead to changing the lives of others. Kelly Burks has recently worked closely with Bala Hatvani, the co-founder of Just Giving, an online fundraising donation page, which raises £1 million a day for charities in the United Kingdom. Well, we've talked about a lot because you're, in a sense, you're head of external communications for Initiatives of Change UK, but you're also very involved in the work that Initiatives of Change does in Switzerland. It's a group known, I mean, many of our listeners in the Middle East are in the Middle East, and in the Middle East it's known as Moral Rearmament, but and has a significant operation in Lebanon, and up to a point in Egypt. But essentially it's an international organization. You tell us what Initiatives of Change is. Maybe that's better, and then we can start from there.
Well, if I really brought it down to a couple of lines, for me, the reason that I'm passionate about Initiatives of Change is because they, what they're about is that change in the wider world happens after an internal change. So, in other words, one doesn't run out to try and change the world for the better before taking a good long look at oneself. And that really an internal sort of transformation that somebody has been through and change will bring about a change in the world around them. And that works really well for me. I think that's a very sound principle in approaching small problems or big problems worldwide. I was just speaking about prisons and so on. So I mean, I think, this this principle of inner change being the first step is a sound one.
Brings to mind the Michael Jackson song, isn't it? I'm looking at the man in the mirror. You have to change. If you want to change the world, change yourself. So and that was your approach. That's what Initiatives of Change is for you.
It is, and you know, they do. It's very hard to describe what Initiatives of Change is, because I mean they've kind of been described as being too many things. But I mean, I don't think that's a bad thing. They work in sustainable communities. They work in conflict resolution. They work in encouraging young people who show promise to realize their dreams. They have a very strong program in integrity in business worldwide, which certainly needs some work. Historically, Frank Bookman was
Frank Bookman's the founder of this group. Yeah.
Frank Bookman was the founder of Initiatives of Change, and so he was working really, and had his people working really very intensely with politicians, for instance. And one of the projects I've been working on is a documentary film about Frank Bookman and his life. And we went to film in Tokyo and met some of the people who had been around and worked with him actually when he was still alive. So they're in their 80s and 90s now. But
well, we're going to come to filmmaking. Yeah. You're going to jump ahead, because I know you are
just
a filmmaker, but just talking about the...
Sure, but I just wanted to say that, you know, so their approach with the post-World War II Japan, which was a disaster area, in working with industry leaders and politicians and so on, was that they created a safe place called MRA House, where those people could come and meet, who never met because they were at odds with each other. And they would talk about their personal problems there and their struggles with their families and what was going on. But that's just a sort of an indication of this one-to-one work, this kind of personal work that MRA, Initiatives of Change, really focuses on with people in getting an idea of change. Because we all have some persona. You have one, I have one, which we put out there to the world. And then we all have the person that we are inside. And I think accessing that person, making that person visible and vulnerable is a really important thing in reaching other people.
Yes, absolutely. I believe that. I find that ideologically you need to be coming from a stronger place if you're going to help other people. And that, I mean, you touched on that when you're talking about prisoners. You said you have to leave Kelly outside the door. You have to leave yourself outside the door. That applies to almost everything. You're empowered if you are not thinking about your own problems. If you're self-absorbed with your own problems, then you're disempowered and weakened when it comes to dealing with the troubles of the world. Saying which, now you have done some interesting work. Yeah, I mean, just picking on one particular issue. You do a lot of work in Switzerland, where Initiatives of Change has a huge center in a place called Co, way up above the sort of tail end of Lake Geneva. You were working particularly this last summer with one particular man who founded the Just Giving organization. Is that right?
That's right, Bela Hadvani. He's been a long time person who's been around IOC for something like 35 years, actually. Bela's an interesting guy. He co-invented the touch screen.
The computer touch screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in the 80s, with a guy named Henry Ning, they invented the first touch screen. And he was mentored the founders of Just Giving.
Just Giving is a just because people may not know it, but it is a platform for charitable giving that's very much used in the West and to a degree internationally.
They're based. They started and are based in England, although they have some other international branches now. But they just started in 2002. And Bela mentored those people, the founders. He kept them from starting for months. They were going crazy because they wanted to get going with it, but he kept going for walks with them and talking to them about serving all constituents in a balanced way and how to set up something that would work for everyone. Because that's his main purpose in life, is that everybody should be equally served in anything that works well. And so they kept with him, and they got going in about 2002, but today, which is whatever that is, 14 years later, they raise over £1 million a day for charities in the UK. And that's quite an astonishing achievement. So he's an amazing man, and it actually goes back to, I was introduced to IFC by a man named Harry Lucas Jr. He's an oil man from Texas. Sounds really at odds with IFC.
We're going back years now.
Yeah.
You were first engaged in.
So, and he introduced me to IFC because my business of 25 years had collapsed in the 2008 crash, and for me it was a huge disaster. I felt like the business I loved had come to an end. And
so this was, what was your business?
I was designing furniture and sculpture and making furniture and sculpture. I was a craftsman and a designer, and did work here in the UK for about 25 years. And previous to that, I had worked in films previously in New York, and my friend Harry knew about that. So when he heard that that had come to an unfortunate demise, he said, well, go over and talk to this guy Emad in Initiatives of Change. They make films over there, because he's somebody who contributes to IFC. And that was how I came in, and I went to meet Emad, and I sat down with him. Emad is Palestinian, obviously a wonderful gentleman who's done tremendous work at IFC. And he looked at me across the table, and I looked at him, and he said, we don't have any money. That's the first thing he said to me.
Now,
and I said to him, well, this is going to be a very short conversation. But here it is, it's now 7 years later, and I've been working with them since. So there was a way that came about that my work there was funded from outside through Harry, and Harry introduced me to Bela Hatvani, who we were just talking about. And when I first met Bela, with Harry, we sat down to talk to him, and he was talking about some ideas that he had. It was kind of like sitting in a room where there's not enough light and it's kind of quite dim, and suddenly the lights come on, you know. That's how I felt. So.
And what were you, this summer with Bela, you were arranging?
Well, this summer he ran something called the Care Inquiry and the Care Economy Inquiry, and that involved all kinds of elements for creating a better society, a better economy that cares for people. And so we had speakers like Enno Schmidt, who's very involved in basic income, universal basic income. He made a film called Grundeinkommen, which...
Universal basic income, you mean a minimum wage? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
so
the concept of a minimum wage.
That's right. So that was somebody who was involved, and some other individuals. I helped. At the time I was finishing a film in Uganda. I was very busy, but I managed to help Bela to organize the people to come and meet him in Co and be there for the inquiry, which ran as part of the Trust and Integrity in the Global Economy Inquiry.
Okay.
Conference.
So
yeah.
Very successful, fascinating, and of course trust and integrity is, well, something we need a lot more of. You see a lack of trust, lack of integrity, lack of transparency in our political figures that's leading people to vote, strangely almost in protest against the whole establishment, and we're seeing that, I think.
Oh yes, recently. I mean, the kind of the apparent links between what happened here with Brexit and this kind of astonishing election result in America.
Yes.
I mean, for me, that election in America, I'm an American, I don't live there. I've lived in London for the last 33 years, but that's really a huge signal. It's like a cry of pain. It's like the disenfranchised lashing out, and it's frightening in some ways because it tells a story of desperation, and not, generally speaking, not many good things come out of desperation or desperate acts. But I would say that vote that happened over there, which absolutely nobody believed would happen and did happen, shows the depth of feeling of people in the States, that they are not being represented, that they don't see a future that relates to them.
In a way similar to the Brexit vote in Britain. You
Exactly.
could argue, anyway, it's arguable. I mean, and we may see more of it. It's possible. We may see similar things in France or whatever, because of this frustration with the establishment. And in a way it's heartening, because it means that, I mean, if, God forbid, but if it's one of the benefits of, this sounds terribly pompous, but one of the benefits of democracy, because otherwise they'd have people, I mean the people, would have to resort to violence to make their frustrations felt.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, there may be violence anyway, I would say.
Yes.
There's already violence,
Yes,
let's say.
yes.
It's already starting. So,
Yeah.
you know,
More work for initiatives of change.
more work for initiatives of change. And I think your organization is great, because you're sort of trying to prevent violence, and we come up and do conflict resolution afterwards.
Oh,
But, you know, sort of all bases covered. But I would say that, yes, that somebody came to me after the election and said, "Oh, are you going to the protests over the election?" And I said, "Well, what would I be protesting about? A democratic vote." I mean, if Hillary, and I'm not at all condoning or agreeing with all the unfortunate things that Mr. Trump has said and spoken about, and the way that he was delivering information during his campaign. But, you know, if Hillary Clinton was the better candidate, she would have been elected, because it was a democratic election.
Exactly, yes.
So,
Yeah.
although she kind of represented the more stable, solid, whatever she represented, they didn't believe her. She wasn't believed. And so, you know, like you said, one can't help feeling a little bit of excitement that, wow, you know, they just want to tip the whole
Apple cart
box
over.
of toys over.
Yes.
Which throw all the toys out of the pram, you know, and let's see what happens. You know, there is something exciting about that. I mean, there's also, obviously, as we all know, there are many dangers with many of the things that we hear. So I think everybody is kind of quite pensive and a little bit hanging on the window ledge, wondering, you know, what's going to transpire out of all of this. I think, you know, again, bringing it back to myself, I think we all need to care for ourselves and to try and create the best possible person we can within ourselves, to try and, let's say, to try and keep a world that is prosperous in human terms, you know, for betterment of humanity.
Bless you. That's strongly and soundly said. We have to move on to our third topic, or we'll run out of time. But this is fascinating. Thank you. Brilliant, Kelly. Kelly Burks has always been passionate about films and filmmaking. Together with his co-director, Eric Bednarski, Kelly has just completed a film about northern Uganda, which was commissioned by the United Nations Development Program. The film has three key aims. The first is to serve as a platform for reconciliation. The second, to close the historical divide between North and South Uganda. And third, the film aims to encourage development and investment, which are, of course, so important in a country like Uganda. He is now working on a film about Frank Bookman, the co-founder of moral rearmament known as Initiative of Change, an organization which Kelly works closely with. Kelly Burks feels that Bookman's ethos is relevant and useful in today's conflict-ridden world. Frank Bookman's ethos is shaped around listening, seeking guidance from God, finding courage and taking action. Kelly Burks sees filmmaking as a tool for change. filmmaking. I mean, filmmaking. I mean, this is what your main incarnation of this moment is. I would say. I mean, in my perception of you, you're a filmmaker. A filmmaker with many hats, but nonetheless a filmmaker. You've been. I mean, there's so much to say, but you told us a little bit about how you got into filmmaking, and you are currently working. You've just completed one film on northern Uganda. Is that right?
That's right. The film is on northern Uganda. My I worked for about 5 years in filmmaking in New York City. My dream when I was a young man was to be a writer and director in films. That when I worked in New York, I was working mainly in commercials and and industrial films, doing production work,
Gotcha.
which was not directing and writing, but I was learning all about the business of filmmaking. And I was dreaming, I began to dream there about doing documentary film work. However, the New York film scene and I were a bit like chalk and cheese. It's a very aggressive, backstabbing, brilliant in some ways, but a very difficult climb to the top and lots of casualties along the way. And I'm not really that kind of a person in my character. So a number of people advised me that I might be better off doing some other things, people who cared about me.
Yes.
And then when I came to London from New York, and I had my business designing and making furniture. I'm a creative person, which I loved and I did for many years. And when that collapsed and I came to IFC and started working with them on some of their films, that was kind of really a return to what I dreamed of doing all the way back in my 20s. And so I've had the great opportunity to work with EMAD and the team. They had For the Love of Tomorrow films there when I started. That then became Initiatives of Change films. And I've worked on a number of their film productions there. Beyond Forgiving is one that EMAD made. That's his big...
Yes, that's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, you've worked on that. That's the concept behind that, just for our listeners, is it's a situation with it's based in South Africa.
Yes.
And a situation in which the mother of a girl that was killed actually doesn't forgive the man responsible for her death, but goes beyond forgiving to offer him some sort of love and fellowship, which is a strange idea, isn't it? It's the idea that you can, in a sense, you can't forgive the deed that killed your child, but you can reconcile with the person responsible. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I think actually in the end she came to the position that she looked at all the historically what white people had done to blacks, and she took personal responsibility for that, and she went with the man who was responsible for the death of her daughter to his village in South Africa and apologized to his village for the history of what whites have done to blacks there. And the tremendous thing about that story is that I think she was able to reach a kind of forgiveness with him, and which completely changed his life, because he wasn't asking for forgiveness, but suddenly this woman appeared, and they then went on and they worked together internationally to talk about the power of forgiveness and how it can really change people's lives.
A remarkable film. Since when? I mean, that was your in the context of Initiatives of Change, your work there with. That was the first of the films that you really
No,
worked.
I mean, quite some time ago, I worked on one of the first films we did was called The Prisoner's Dilemma, which was just we did these little films which were sort of meant to be training films. When I first started at IFC, they were just finishing An African Answer, and I I worked with the team organizing the premiere for that film. It was a sequel to The Imam and the Pastor, which is a very well-known film that they've done.
A film some of our listeners might have seen, because
Yes.
it certainly had some impact in the Middle East. It's a film about a pastor and an imam basically getting together in an area of Africa,
Yes.
where there was tension between
in
religions.
Nigeria. They were at war for 20 years. They were killing each other's people, were killing each other off. The pastor's hand was chopped off with a machete. The imam's brother was murdered. They hated each other. And in the end, they came together and agreed to work for peace.
Mm.
And so they're another example of two people who are traveling the world, working in other countries, working with people to reconcile with each other.
A remarkable film. And then more lately, you've been working on this Uganda film, because I would want to touch on that.
Yes.
That was very interesting, because again, we're talking about a situation in northern Uganda.
Mm.
Well, you tell us. There'd been terrible times for that.
Yes, indeed. The pathway was that in 2013 we made a little film for Bela Hatvani called Change. I took that to Co
Right.
to show it there, and we screened the film there, and this kind of amazing sort of African princess looked like a tall Nigerian woman in traditional dress came up and tugged on my sleeve and said, "Let's go for a walk." And I said, "Absolutely." She turned out to be Ahuna Isaikanwa. She was the resident coordinator for the United Nations in Uganda. And she liked the film, and we started talking about a film in Uganda. That was 3 years ago. And so it was a long process, but after 6 months of kind of talking back and forth, she came to me and said, "I know what I wanted to make it about." And it was about the Acholi people in northern Uganda who suffered for 20 years in the war between Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army and the government troops from southern Uganda. They were caught in the middle of that. There were many, many atrocities committed. Over 2 million people were forced to live in internally displaced people's camps where disease was rife, there was no education, no work. They were totally dependent on UN trucks bringing food.
Just to put it in context, because some of our listeners many of us will know, but some of us won't know what the Lord's Resistance Army is. This is a group, sort of rebels come gangsters who terrorized not just northern Uganda, but much of that area of Africa for a number of years. A remnant is still there, but how would you describe them?
Well, actually, it's a long story. All these stories have a long route. It goes back to British colonial times, actually, but I won't go that far back. But growing out of what happened when the British were there as colonials, there's developed a divide between northern and southern Uganda. And when the British left in 1962, this divide, the sway of power in Uganda started to happen between north and south, and so the powers that were residing in southern Uganda at a stage produced this woman appeared named Alice Lakwena who started the Lord's Resistance Army, and it wasn't what it became. They were amazing and they were quite successful, and they went into battle with coconut oil, I think, rubbed on their chests, or palm oil, and thought they were bulletproof and all kinds of things. But they in the end, the government troops managed to beat them back, and she escaped to Kenya, and she actually died in a camp in Kenya. But the remnants of the LRA were still around, and Joseph Kony, who lived in northern Uganda, went to a huge rock mountain and spent 4 days there, and the story he told was that he spoke to the spirits there, and they instructed him to take over the LRA, and so they were insurgents. They were having an insurgency against the existing government in Uganda.
Headed by Joseph Kony.
Headed by Joseph Kony, who was from northern Uganda himself. And initially he was seen as a hope for the north because they felt like they were being persecuted by the south. But before very long, he started and the LRA started to commit a lot of atrocities against the north because they started to feel like maybe they shouldn't support him, and he started to take revenge on them. And that began the nightmare. So he was actually persecuting his own people. The LRA was committing terrible atrocities against the north. And war is hell. I mean, the troops from the south were fighting the LRA. There were a lot of things happening with them and the people, and they were putting all these people in camps. So the people really went through 20 years of very, very difficult atrocities. And what emerged from that was a broken populace of damaged people. Psychosocial trauma in over 90% of the population.
Yes.
So Ahuna's vision for the film, because many films and books have been made about the tragedy of the North, her vision was to make a film that would draw out the dignity of the people, remind them of their culture, and to find some positive stories, some people in northern Uganda who have started to turn the corner, have had an internal change, have been able to forgive, find some empathy, and started to move on, as an example to other northern Ugandans. And also to encourage investment and development in the north, because there are a lot of myths about it's too dangerous, too difficult, so on, and there's terrible poverty, so they need development and investment. And the third thing was to make a small dent in the divide between the north and the south of Uganda. So it was kind of like 2.5 or 3 films in one.
Yes, I've seen it. It's very good.
It was a very challenging brief, I must say.
Remarkable achievement, because it is very positive, and yet comes out of a very dark place.
Yes.
And so it really is an achievement. And just one of you're now working on the. I know, I understand that you're working or just finishing off a film about Bookman, the man who we mentioned earlier, but that's a biographical film about the man and his beliefs, who founded Initiatives of Change. Yes, I mean, we just finished the Uganda film in July, and that was for the United Nations Development Program, so that's brilliant. They're taking that film and putting it into their structures worldwide. They're very excited about the film. The Bookman film has been a long story, and it's been great to work with Emad Karam on that film. We've filmed in the United States, we filmed in Japan, in India, in Korea, and Scotland, and Europe, and his very good idea was to try and capture some of the people who actually spent time with Bookman before they passed away. And so a number of the people we interviewed have passed away since we started making the film. Yes, because Bookman was active in the wartime, the Second World War, and the years after. Yes, with MRA, with Moral Rearmament. He started with the Oxford group, but then that was a kind of a Christian fellowship, and then he decided that there was more important work to do in the world around conflict and healing people after conflict. And they actually worked after World War I, between the wars, between World War I and World War II, and did tremendous work after World War II worldwide as well, in many countries that were affected by the war. His kind of vision for the world was amazing, and actually Moral Rearmament and Frank Bookman did such tremendous work. But today, even in his own, we went to the town where he was born in Pennsylvania, and many people didn't know who he was. So he was a very humble man, but he was actually doing this tremendous worldwide work, and he's very unknown today. I would say the principles and the ideas that he had are ever so relevant to the world we live in today. We live in a distress-torn world with so many
conflict problems going on, so many ongoing problems. And my passion for working on that film is really, I've said to EMAD, we need to make a film that gives Frank Bookman back to the world, because he's kind of gone into obscurity.
Well, his ethos is much of what you've been talking about, forgiveness, isn't it? And combined with a concept of listening to God and this unselfishness that, again, the themes that you've been
seeking
echoing.
Guidance, yes, seeking guidance, listening, really listening for guidance. And the great things about Bookman were courage. So he would seek guidance, and then he would find courage, and then he would take action. And I think that is just brilliant. That's the thing that I admire the most about him. He had concepts which were just off the scale. He took 200 people to India in 1955, I believe, to perform all these plays that they had written, which showed kind of different kind of struggles of people in families and so on, kind of a personal level, with these enormous lights. They were dragging them around India with 200 people, and they had somebody running ahead to each new village and saying to the mayor, "We're coming here to perform these plays." They were there for 6 months, crisscrossing across India, and they actually reached hundreds of thousands of people with that, and it had a tremendous impact on India in that kind of post-war time.
Well, now, and your filmmaking is really carrying on that tradition.
It is, and I think the filmmaking tradition in IOC is a very strong one. Any good film, any good documentary film or good film is a great tool, and it's the tradition of storytelling, and filmmaking is good storytelling, and every good film is a tool that can be used, for change.
This is what we're talking. Kelly, we're going to have to, we've run out of time, but on that note, I mean, a tool for change, and your life is about delivering that. It's really inspiring, and God grant that you may have real success with whatever is your next project. You're going to have to move on now to a new adventure.
Yes, I'm certainly looking into several things at the moment, and it's very, very important for me to focus on right direction.
Yes.
It often looks like it's something that's going to possibly work against me, but if it is a right action, my experience is that is always a good place to put my energy. Although I may not know what the outcome will be, it tends to be something that is good for me as well.
Oh, bless you, Kelly. Thank you so much for being our guest on ANN Television. It's been a real privilege to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great talking with you, William. Thank you so much.
So interesting. What have we learned? It is very fascinating the way filmmaking can be a tool for change, a tool for a better world. We need to build a better world, all of us. And we all have our different ways to do it. But there is a responsibility incumbent on each one of us. And when it comes down to it, that ethos that Kelly was talking about, the idea that we have to make a change, we start with ourselves. We have to make ourselves right if we're going to change the world. Unless we sort ourselves out, how can we begin to tell others what they should do? So it's an important issue, well, to help others do what they should do. It's an important issue. It's an issue one we need to think about, change we need to make in ourselves if we are going to stand up for a better, a more positive world. And God knows we need that today. The other fascinating point is this issue of young people, young offenders. I think that we all want to care more for the vulnerable in this world. And we've said this before on ANN, but the vulnerable are the very young, the very old, the disabled, the broken, the refugee, people who are in need of our help. And certainly we see this in Britain and in the West. There are too many young people incarcerated in jail. And without some form of rehabilitation, which is what we're talking about, what Kelly and people like Kelly offer, there is no way out so often for these people. And drugs and alcohol is an element in the mix of the problem, the social problem we face in the West today and the world faces. It's a problem everywhere, really, in some shape or form. And we need to overcome this. It's something we need to give thought to ourselves and think about how we can indeed help others. Thank you for being with us on ANN Television. Thank you for this time together. Bless you.